The HOA board secretly reclassified Josephine May's home as common land and sold it without her knowledge. Their president, Eliza Franks, thought a forged loophole and a smug smile would be enough to bury the truth. But Josephine, a retired surveyor, brought evidence so precise it shattered their entire scheme in court. And just wait until you see how the law sealed her victory forever. For over 2 decades, Josephine Mays had been a quiet fixture on Oakbrush Lane, a slender stretch of road lined with new money and old politics. Her cedar-sided ranch sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac, surrounded by cottonwoods and golden chamisa, untouched by the manicured chaos that had overtaken the rest of the neighborhood. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't loud, but she was solid. A retired land surveyor with a sharp mind and steady hands, Josephine had mapped half the foothills before most of the HOA board even moved in. After her husband passed, she stayed, keeping to her routines, walking trails at dawn, pruning the heirloom apple tree her father had grafted, paying dues without complaint, and tending to her patch of heritage sunflowers that leaned along the split-rail fence like sleepy soldiers. So, when a registered envelope arrived one breezy April morning, plain white, no return address, she thought it might be tax paperwork or an insurance update. She opened it at her kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of tea and no reason to expect what she found. The first line read, "This notice serves as formal authorization of the pending vacation of 221 Oakbrush Lane for development." Her eyes moved slowly, methodically, over the rest. Per the HOA Board's approval and sale authorization dated March 17th, ownership of the parcel, known as Lot 14, has been transferred to Apex Realty Development for multi-unit housing. Please vacate within 30 days to allow site preparation. Josephine stared at the paper for a full minute. The room around her seemed to quiet down, like the world itself was holding its breath. She hadn't sold her home. She hadn't listed it. No one had even called to ask if she was thinking about it. She stood, letter trembling slightly in her hand, and walked to the window. Everything looked exactly the same. Her fence line, straight and sturdy, the spring bulbs peeking through mulch, the wind chimes lazily turning in the porch shadow. But something had shifted. It wasn't her home anymore, at least not on paper. By evening the knock came. A man in a navy sport coat and 2 white smiles stood on her step, holding a folder and acting like this was just a routine welcome call. "Miss Mays," he said, pronouncing her name like he'd rehearsed it. "Chase Weller, Apex Realty. I wanted to personally introduce myself and say how excited we are to bring modern, efficient housing to this historic block. The board's been a great partner." She didn't respond. She was too busy staring at the folder he casually flipped open. Inside was a deed, with her address, signed by 3 HOA board members, stamped, recorded. "They told me the parcel had been idle for years," Chase continued, glancing at her wind chimes. "Honestly, I'm surprised you're still living here." He smiled again, warm, practiced, and faintly dismissive, like the dirt beneath her home had already been measured and sold off square foot by square foot. And just like that, Josephine realized the truth. They hadn't made a mistake. They'd made a decision. And they thought she was too old, too quiet, and too alone to stop them. Josephine didn't waste time. The morning after Chase Weller's visit, she pulled on her gardening boots, still caked with last week's rain, and drove straight to the HOA building. It was one of those faux adobe structures the neighborhood had voted to fund years ago, all sandstone tones and unnecessary fountains, perched proudly next to the clubhouse that barely anyone used. She didn't ask for an appointment. She walked through the glass doors, bypassed the front desk, and headed straight for the boardroom. Eliza Franks was inside, sipping something foamy from a stainless steel tumbler and scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when Josephine stepped in. "Eliza," Josephine said, voice tight, "we need to talk." The HOA president finally met her gaze, slow and unbothered. She set her drink down, adjusted the sleeve of her cashmere blazer, and leaned forward over the polished marble desk. "Well, look who's up early. Something wrong, Joe?" "You sold my house." Eliza blinked once. Oh, that, Josephine repeated. You sold my address without notice, without consent, and without cause. This better be a mistake. But Eliza didn't look surprised. She looked rehearsed. The bylaws, she said with that same slippery tone realtors use to upsell square footage, grant the board authority to reclassify and repurpose common land for future development. Josephine's breath caught. My home isn't common land. Eliza shrugged, lips curving like it amused her. That's what you'll have to prove in court, but Apex already recorded the deed. I'd recommend you start packing before the construction fencing goes up. Silence settled, thick and electric. Josephine's hands curled at her sides, not with panic, but with precision, the kind of anger that's too clear to burn out quickly. When she got home that night, she began to dig. Within 3 hours, she found the HOA's March meeting minutes. Buried under vague budget approvals and landscaping updates was a single-line item, Motion #12, reclassification of Lot 14 as unconfirmed private holding, eligible for reclamation under Article 7, Clause C. It passed 3-0, no public hearing, no mailed notice, no legal challenge window, Lot 14. Her lot. The reclassification wasn't an accident. It was a loophole. A knife slid quietly between the lines of old bylaws and newer greed. Eliza had claimed that a minor recording error from the late 90s made Josephine's title uncertain. Not void, just uncertain. And that gave the board a path to seize it. Quietly. Legally. If no one noticed. They hadn't just stolen her home. They'd planned it. Documented it. Voted on it behind closed doors. And now they were smiling like she was already gone. Josephine didn't cry. She'd already done that years ago, on the night she buried her husband, and again when she signed the last mortgage check herself. This time, she didn't have space for tears. Only resolve. She went into her study, opened the old flat file cabinet that hadn't been touched in years, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilskin and twine. Her surveyor's certification, a stamped field journal, and the brass compass she'd used on half the ridge projects east of the Pecos. Then she started making calls. First to Marlene Dorsey, the city registrar she'd once mentored through her licensing exam. Then to Ramon Esquivel, an old friend of her late husband's, who now served as an associate judge for the New Mexico Land Court in Albuquerque. And finally to a records clerk at the Bureau of Land Management who still remembered Josephine's birthday. By Thursday, she had unearthed the original survey plats for Lot 14, drawn in her own handwriting, filed in triplicate, and officially logged in 1997. By Friday, she found something better. A notarized correction deed from 1998, resolving the so-called recording error Eliza had claimed as her legal loophole. It had been processed, stamped, and confirmed by the county office, 20 years before the HOA had even formed. It wasn't a gray area. It wasn't a technicality. It was her land. Clean, legal, indisputable. Josephine organized every page, plats, deeds, affidavits, correspondence, into a folio stitched in leather by her husband's hands before his stroke. Then she drove down to the courthouse in Albuquerque, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the clerk's office like she belonged there, because she did. When the clerk asked if she had legal counsel, Josephine calmly replied, "No, I have evidence." 2 days later, she stood in front of the judge with her folio open, every page aligned with index tabs and historical notations. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The judge, a man who'd once shared dinner with her and her husband after a zoning conference in Los Alamos, flipped through the documents with furrowed brows and deepening silence. At the end, he leaned back, hands folded. "This deed," he said slowly, holding up the 1998 correction, was legally binding and fully recorded. Any attempt to circumvent it constitutes the deliberate misrepresentation of title. And then, looking down at the HOA's counsel, "This isn't a misunderstanding, it's fraud." The ruling came swiftly. The court voided Apex Realty's purchase. The HOA's reclassification was deemed illegal. Josephine's ownership was reaffirmed in full, with a formal judicial order recorded at the county level. But it didn't stop there. The court imposed punitive damages, 3 times the assessed property value, for willful misconduct, plus all legal costs. The HOA board was reprimanded in the public record, with potential civil penalties pending review. Josephine didn't gloat. She simply gathered her papers, thanked the court, and walked out, head high, boots clicking steadily down the polished corridor. They'd underestimated her. Now the law had corrected them. By late summer, the cracks in the boardroom walls had widened. Eliza Franks, once the unshakable face of the HOA, all pressed suits and polished confidence, resigned without ceremony. Rumors of a criminal referral circled like hawks, and though no charges were officially filed, the message was clear. Her influence was gone. Apex Realty, once eager to bulldoze and build across half the county, quietly pulled out of 2 other neighborhood deals. No press release, no statements, just a quiet vanishing act after the headlines splashed the court's ruling across every local outlet. But for Josephine, the real moment came in early September. She stood at her mailbox with the morning sun warming her shoulders and tore open a heavy envelope stamped with the seal of the New Mexico Land Court. Inside was a crisp new title certificate, her name etched at the top in bold serif, and below it a clause written in unmistakable language. This property, known as Lot 14, shall be immune to reclassification, reassignment, or sale by any administrative or private body without trial by jury and full judicial oversight. It wasn't just ownership, it was armor. She framed the certificate and hung it above the fireplace, where her husband's compass used to rest. It was more than a legal win. It was the preservation of everything she had built, fought for, and refused to surrender. Then she went outside, pulled her favorite folding chair into the shade of the porch, and planted an extra row of sunflowers, twice as many as last year. They arched proudly over the fence, bright and defiant, dancing in the breeze like sentries. Before the month was over, realtors started driving past again, some slowly, some not even trying to hide their curiosity. But now, every time they paused, they were greeted by a brand new bronze plaque bolted to the fence post. The engraving was simple, permanent, impossible to misread, private land, verified by court order. And Josephine, hands folded in her lap and the sun on her face, would simply smile, not to show off, not for pride, but because sometimes peace tastes sweeter when it's earned one page, one hearing, and one stubborn truth at a time.